I'm here with Martin Gledhill, who is an academic who researches Jung architecture and is going to talk about Jung's house in Bollingen, which is kind of a personal project and culminated in the intersection of a whole lot of his lifelong projects and passions. I guess if you want to just kind of start and go over some of your work about Bollingen, I know the listeners will be fascinated. It's not a topic a ton of people know a lot about, so I mean, you're probably in the minority in the world there.
Yeah, well, that'd be good. I mean, it's a kind of bizarre passion that I've got. I suppose I'm a trained architect, so I've always thought that architecture, really could be a bit more meaningful. And then maybe, I don't know, 30, 40 years ago, I started going into therapy, partly because I wasn't very good at relationships, and I suppose these two threads for me have sort of come together. So actually, I made a massive decision to give up my work, give up where I was teaching at university, and just embark on this project. So it's been running for about 7 years, and I suppose the kind of backdrop is that I think therapeutic practice probably could involve place more. Place seems to be sort of absent from the discussion, even in the therapy room, and perhaps hope that's not offensive or difficult to anyone. Anyway.
No, I mean, do you find that in dream work they make room for place in the sense that you're describing, or do you mean another way that place could intersect with therapy?
Well, I suppose in dream work it can be sort of amplified more, but I think the role of what you might call psychic place, a sense of belonging, or the presence of where we live, particularly obviously it's very, very potent in a home, less so in bigger places, and maybe more so or most so in religious environments. But I think matter, if you put it in terms of matter, I think it's kind of slightly pushed out from the kind of therapeutic dialogue, particularly in analytical psychology, in my experience. I mean, obviously that might be slightly contentious. So I think why Jung's really interesting is that he begins that journey, doesn't he, through alchemy, an engagement with matter, and Marie von Franz sort of carries the torch, literally. But if you think about it, it's quite rare for a psychologist to conceive their family home, Kuschnacht, and to, well, not exactly build Bollingen, but certainly to begin to build Bollingen. And then, in effect, he's operating as an architect in two places. So over to you. Fire a question at me, Joel, whilst I catch my...
No, I think that's a great intro. I mean, it was an attempt to kind of build something with all of the different tools that Jung had found over his life. I mean, I think he kind of was really hungry for a unified theory of everything, almost.
Yeah.
On the inside of the mind. He wasn't as existentially concerned. It was phenomenological, what is going on inside of me and other people that I see and that they feel and that I feel. And a lot of that intersected with Bollingen, but it's not very well understood. And you saying that the gateway to alchemy is kind of the bridge between the matter and the mind, because you're working on things of the mind through metaphors of matter and science. That's a great intro. I never thought of it that way.
Yeah, I think it's kind of the unfinished work of analytical psychology, which to a degree Marie von Franz sort of picked up on. But I suppose coming at the tower from a different angle. I mean, I have to say that the Jung family have been absolutely wonderful in their generosity of talking to me about it. And it's quite difficult to get into the tower, and I mean it's a private home, so no one tramping over it. So the privacy and probity of the family, I think, need to be respected, and certainly they respect Jung's legacy, which is why a lot of it is kind of inaccessible in all senses of the word.
You can't photograph the inside at all, even if you're allowed in, correct? Is that right?
Well, you can go into I've been there 4 times now, and you can go downstairs, but there's a real sense of the above, if you like.
The tower has murals and things that people haven't seen.
Say again,
is that correct? The tower has like murals and things that people haven't seen. Is that right?
Yeah, and there are. you know, there's, you know, I would suggest I probably am only aware of maybe, I don't know, maybe 25-30% of it, and I absolutely respect that legacy. I mean, really, the Jung family. Well, when Jung died, he wanted the tower to be left kind of as it was. So, you know, I've had some really amusing moments where I arrived one day and the filament stone was providing a very good picnic table. You know, for a Jungian, oh my, you know, this kind of sacred stone, which, you know, there was no disrespect. It's just a working, living retreat for the heirs of the family. So, sort of coming at it from a different angle, I think the account in Memories, Dreams, and Reflections is incomplete, I think I would say. And because, you know, people like Samdashani have done a lot of work on working out which bits were written by who, no disrespect to Anil Yaffe, but I think it's incomplete, at times a little bit inaccurate. You know, it's been tidied up, basically. And
well, I mean, there's chapters of it that the family never wanted published.
Yeah.
So it is objectively incomplete, right? I mean, he wrote things that are not in it.
Yeah, but even, I mean, you know, so it's incomplete in two ways. A, there's missing chapters. So, you know, for example, you know, the memory of Tony Wolff. You know, there's I think Alan Elms called it, was Alan Elms or someone called it the artification. But I suppose what I'm interested in is that the chapter itself, chapter 8, the tower, is not really about the tower. If you think about it, it's only about 3 pages talk about the tower. Then it goes off into ancestors and you know, sort of much wider issues, and that's kind of fine. But you think, well, the biography of the tower, in a sense, I think needs to be written.
The biography of Bollingen Tower.
Yeah, I mean, actually, that idea came from Jost Herney, who is Jung's great-grandson. And I was, sounds a bit posy this, but I was chatting to him in the loggia, and he just said, oh, I want to write the biography of the tower. Well, what I think he meant was the biography of the people who visited the tower. And
because the family has Jungian, you know, interested people kind of disturbing their privacy all the time. From what I've just seen accounts where people wander up to it and they say, okay, you know, you can come in, you can see part of it, and you know, they're gracious.
Yeah,
but it is, people are peeping at it all the time, you know.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very nice way of putting it, Joel. The grace. I mean, on one occasion, mates of mine were rowing up to the tower because I wanted to photograph it from the lake, from Lake Zurich, and these people were waving at us, and we thought they were basically waving for us to go away, but then we realised they were actually waving for us to come ashore. So we kind of landed, and they were, you know, incredibly hospitable, but with a containment in equal measure. You know, it wasn't just sort of open house. So you know, I think the story of the tower is interesting to tell in the context of place, psychic place. I think MDR is incomplete, and actually, you know, in the Jung family there are 6 architects. His uncle was an architect, his cousin was an architect, his son-in-law, his grandson Andreas, and his great-grandson Daniel. So there's this kind of I owe this information to Andreas, his grandson. You know, there's this kind of architectural thread, which in some senses is linked to archaeology. You know, that Jung was interested in archaeology and wanted to be an archaeologist. So it's a kind of reverse archaeology, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, rather than sort of digging
it's
down.
building the thing to be discovered by the future instead of discovering the thing, you know, that left by the past.
Yeah. So, you know, it's absolutely fascinating. And at the moment, I'm probably about 92,000 words. And I just keep on, you know, if you think back to the formative places, you know, Lauthen, Rhine Falls, Klein-Hunnigan, you know, in all of these places are clues to the tower. You know, his walking fantasy when he walks along the Rhine, when he sees the big ship coming along and constructs a kind of well-fortified castle. He's basically constructing place all the time. The attic, the mannequin in the attic. But what seems to happen in MDR is that these places are sort of backgrounded. What comes to the foreground are psychological or theological, philosophical kind of extrapolations, but the place is somehow lost. And I suppose that's what I feel my job, if you like, is to follow his tracks, if you like. Which means going to Switzerland a lot.
Sure.
So over to you, Joel.
Well, and maybe some people have a familiarity with Jung, but maybe don't know a lot about Bollingen. I mean, you can't tell the whole story that you're telling in the book, but could you give us kind of a brief history of his relationship with that place?
Yeah. Well, essentially, at the beginning, if you're to believe MDR, Bollingen sort of emerges around 1922-23, just after his mother's death. Now, he asked his son-in-law to be, Walter Nias, who was a very accomplished modern architect, to sketch out a kind of primitive hut. As
initially, he wanted it to be built in like medieval type architecture, right? Is that right? And Emma says no, it needs to be more contemporary, and he changes the style a little bit.
Not so much, not as far as I'm aware, but I think he wanted it to be a very primitive hut. The single story kind of round dwelling, much like you would find in East Africa that he visits in 25, isn't it? 27. Yeah, when did he go to Africa? 25. 25, 26. And so it's immediately adapted and acquires another floor. But actually, there is a sort of backstory, because he used to sail down Lake Zurich, which takes about maybe half a day, 3/4 of a day, depending on the wind, to a place called the Linth Island, which is right by Schmeriken at the bottom. And he used to camp there with a mate who was a psychiatrist, I think. And then after a while, the family used to join him camping, and he really wanted the tower to be founded or to be built there. So, I think probably Emma said to him, well, look, it's kind of fine, all this camping, Carl, but, we kind of need something a bit more permanent, given that Kushnek's quite a luxurious house.
He was kind of enamored with spaces by water,
Yes, he was. Yeah, the castle that he visited as a young boy on Lake Constance, sort of cemented that kind of allegiance. Anyway, the locals weren't too keen on him buying the land as a kind of inverted commas witch doctor, and so his friend said, "Well, why don't you look around a bit closer?" And basically, where Bollingen is now is about a 20-minute canoe ride. I'm not very fit, so it took me 20 minutes. It might have taken him a quarter of an hour by sail. And he landed there one day, and a young boy called Hans greeted him, and he said, well, I'm interested in buying this land. They became very good friends. He became a kind of surrogate son who helped him a lot in the town. So the tower, the first stage gets built, and then about 4 years later, the annex, what's called the annex, or the tower-like annex, gets built. So it's really a holiday home. If I was really honest, it's a holiday home first and foremost.
But it's not modern. There's not electricity. No. I mean, it's a primitive. You pump your water. You cook on a wood-burning stove. I mean, it's very
primitive,
rustic retreat from technology.
Yeah, and that still is the case. That you have to, the water is pumped up from the lake. There's an external toilet, and there's no electricity. So the building becomes. It starts really as a holiday home or a storehouse. It acquires this annex, and then it acquires a third phase 4 years later, which is called the spiritual tower, which only Jung had a key to, and it was a very closed and I imagine to be a very.
It was his private study, even the family wasn't able to go in.
Yeah, so in a way, he's constantly retreating. He's retreating from Krishna, he's retreating from his family, he's retreating up. And then 4 years after that, although I think this is inaccurate. The what's called the loggia and the courtyard are added, but I think those are actually two separate phases when you look at the the joints in the stone and various kind of.
And he said he cut the stones for the tower, not the whole house, but the tower himself, or he had some interaction with it. Is that right?
Well, I've got pictures of. I reckon that he and his son Franz, who's an architect, and Walter Nias and maybe Hans as well, probably built the stone walls up to about maybe a meter, because you can see a change in style after that. Now the walls are about at least a meter thick, so to build that on your own with no artisanal skill is a big ask. So I think they kind of just gave. Well, they didn't give up, but they just became realistic, and they hired some Italian builders to build it. So it starts to be, in effect, built by others. And if you think about it, during this time, Jung is away a lot. He's in Africa, he's in America, later on he's in India. She's really traveling, he's really going. So, who's the author of the tower, in a way?
Yeah.
And then eventually in the early 50s, he adds a third story, or sometimes known as the fifth episode, which actually I think is designed by his son Franz. And that's a much more open space. Most of the other spaces are very chthonic, very enclosed, very mysterious, and as you've indicated, quite medieval. So it's basically got these 5 stages. You might argue that the filament stone is a kind of 6th stage, or a 4+.
Can you tell us about the filament stone, which is maybe like not the capstone, but the end stone? It's the last piece that he makes.
Yeah,
as kind of an ending.
Well, the quarry that supplied, there were a series of quarries in Bollingen, and the story goes that the quarry that supplied were asked to supply a cornerstone, which actually was supposed to be triangular. Arrived as a cube, and the mason said, "Well, you need to take it away. It's just wrong, And Jung, sort of, the very intuitive man, spotted it, and it immediately, in a sense, recognized its kind of charge, its psychic charge. So it's a cubic stone, and has links to kind of alchemy, and he carved it. He carved 3 sides of it. So he was really interested in the idea of the quaternity, the 3+1 pattern. So one side is blank, one side has the figure of a figure with a circle around it, and
like
then
a mandala.
It's kind of it's probably not a mandala. It's more, I can never pronounce it, the Telesphorus, but this kind of figure in the middle, and various other Latin and Greek phrases. But the kind of Christian resonance is interesting, because the kind of discarded stone, the unwanted stone, is a kind of trope for Christ.
The stone the builder rejected is an idea that spoke to Jung when the builder is rejecting the stone.
So it's outside the curtilage of the tower. During the winter, they put a little sort of copper cap on it, and this is actually where there was a picnic table. It's kind of wonderful, and Jung is often pictured sitting by it, and he argues in MDR that all his work was encapsulated in that stone. Everything he had to say was in that stone. So it's a very precious, and for some, sacred object. And then he carved other elements of the tower. He carved a bear, which has been associated with Russia, but could equally be associated with Saint Minrad, whose cult belongs to that area. Pegasus. There's the tomb to his the engraving to his wife. So it's a very tattooed building externally. So it's
he starts to use it almost as a diary or a journal.
Yeah, that's a really lovely idea, Joel. It's a kind of it's a diary. It's a memory aid. It's a body. It's it's kind of not really a building in a way. I mean,
Mhm.
of course, it is a building, but it's much more. Obviously, I'm slightly addicted to it, so I perhaps read in things into it. But it has a very definite sense of place, and these engravings and paintings, and just the darkness of it is very, very alluring.
It is, literally dark. It's something you can't see inside of, either because you can't get inside or because it's lit by candles and lamps. It's a castle.
Yeah, I mean, it's the annex bit. The second phase is a bit more open because it had a big sort of barn door, which is slightly subsumed in the third phase. But it's sort of dark, as you've alluded to, in all senses. This kind of, and really, my own work has been going through all the different biographies and pulling out little memories that people have in order to get to sort of piece together the missing bits, if you like. So it's a sort of a big detective story.
Well, and I know Sam Shadani and James Hillman in the Lament for the Dead book, one of the things that they talk about is that Jung is retreating into the highest part of the tower, which is like the most personal spot for him, where no one is allowed in, not even the mistress Tony Wolf or his wife Emma as much. Maybe they see it, but it's his space. And at the same time, he's grieving that he's not understood by the world. So he's retreating inward, but also grieving and sad that he is not understood by more people or can't bring his internal vision out in a way. And him spending time in that internal vision of the top of the tower helps him clarify it and rarefy it and process it so that he can bring out a revelation to people, so that not just he can have the experience internal, but a lot of the Jungian ethics, his personal ethics, was that you can retreat into the unconscious, you can retreat into the self, but you need to bring something back for other people. You need to bring something back that is not just for you, but for everyone. And I think one of the biggest arguments in that book is that what he brings out of it is that it's not just that we have the obligation to go past the unlived life of the parent and to go past, where our parents didn't quite finish their lives themselves, but we have the responsibility to go past the unlived life of all of the dead in human culture, all the things that humanity has not dealt with, all the things that humanity has not done yet, and that we need to find a way to transcend, our animal nature. We need to find a way to transcend our bias and our not just personal shadow, but our cultural and human shadow. And that's kind of their argument, I think, in Lament for the Dead, is that that's what he is saying with the Red Book. And a lot of that is made while he's contemplating the murals in that tower and painting them.
Yeah, no, that's very well put, Joel. I think that in fact, Shantasani argues that really the tower, and I agree with him, the tower is a continuation of the Red Book.
Yeah.
It's a three-dimensional.
And the Red Book is brought out of the tower in a certain way. Even if he's not working on it there, he's spending the formative time in the self there and then bringing it out. That's the relic,
Yeah. Well, actually, I mean, if you look at quite a lot of the pictures in the Red Book, I mean, particularly the mandala one of the fort, there's actually one. I can't remember the chapter. I think it's chapter 2. There's an element called the Castle by the Lake, which actually, I think the date of that is 1913. It's pretty well a vision of the tower as it, like 50, 20, 30, 40 years later. So I think it's a kind of ongoing, almost transcends time, that there's this kind of slippage between the imagery of the Red Book and the tower itself. So I was going to say something else, and it's just gone out of my mind. It's, I mean, really what's called the spiritual tower, which is let's call it the third phase, 1931, I think has quite a lot of link to Ravenna, his trip to Ravenna. But I think that is his inward place, the most condensed inward place. The fifth episode, the top, is much more transparent, and it has a timber frame, so it's kind of open to the lake. So you've got this kind of delicious, it's not really a dualism, because it sort of transcends it. There's this kind of closeness and openness in equal measure. I mean, as you said earlier on, that I think his disenchantment with the world,
Mm-hmm.
he puts it in terms of, like Merlin, he had to retreat to a tower in the wood, because the world was too damn stupid to sort of understand. I think it is a kind of, well, Giegrich has been very critical of that kind of renouncing of the world. He calls it a sort of psycho Disneyland, which is pretty harsh, I think. And he's not alone. Like people like Rilke, Rainer Maria Rilke, or the Irish poet Yeats. They all retreat to towers. So there is a kind of post-war pattern.
Well, and I think too, Jung. One of the things David Tacey pointed out on our last interview was that, like, Jung borrows a lot of ideas from Hinduism, and one of the images is that relationship between Brahman and Atman, that the self and God have a relationship and are through religion merged together, but or ritual, or whatever whatever you want to call it, liminal space. But I think another one that doesn't get as much, it's not talked about as much, that he takes from Hinduism, is that there's the idea of dharma and moksha in Hinduism, that you have to have a world renunciation, giving up your belongings, wandering and retreating from the world into the woods. That is part of spirituality. But so is the world sustaining, having children, raising a family, giving to the poor, contributing to society, using your intellect. That also is the way that is a responsibility of the religious person. So the relationship between those, and in the Hindu tradition, there's a lot of, some people say, well, you do this at the beginning of your life, and at the end you go into the woods, or, well, you do this and then you take the realization and you bring it back into life. And they try, and because these are opposites, but the tension of those opposites is something that was interesting to Jung. And I kind of see some of that in Bollingen, that he's retreating into himself at the same time that he's trying to formulate something to bring out of himself. I don't know if that makes sense.
No, absolutely. I think there's two things that come to mind when you talked about that. The first, inverts the story, it becomes a businessman, doesn't it? And then returns, that story. But more potently, I think Brother Klaus, the Swiss mystic, who Mark Twain was quite playful about, because he was a saint who had a wife and 10 kids, and then when he was 50, he just kind of left home. So and actually Jung talks about Brother Klaus quite a lot as that balancing of in effect family life and the solitary life. It's kind of inevitable that it splits, isn't it, in a way, Kushnacht and Bollingen.
Well, and he's writing the Red Book in the evenings, while he's seeing patients and spending time with his children and family, with what he says is an anchor. His family and his children were an anchor that saved him from psychosis while he was exploring a psychotic episode, essentially.
Yeah. I suppose what we should remember, though, that actually, and I don't mean this with any cynicism, that Bollingen is a holiday home, and actually a lot of photographs, the kids are playing, he's sitting by the lake, playing with the water. So, it isn't this kind of culling of family life.
It's not a church. It's not supposed to be. It's a retreat for a family.
Yeah, and I suppose that's why he has to find a retreat within a retreat, if you like, which was your point. They're kind of going up. I guess he used to put up a yellow flag, partly for his neighbour to in effect repel their children, because they would come round and knock, and the yellow flag meant no, I'm writing. I
didn't know that.
Yeah, so there's these signals, and I think the enclosure that includes the loggia, really he describes as I felt a need for a piece of fenced in land, but really he probably got fed up with people like me coming along the lake saying, oh, there's Carl Jung and his wife Emma.
So, and he spent time in Bollingen with Einstein too, drinking red wine and talking about physics, and ultimately coming up with the theory of synchronicity, didn't he?
Yeah, well, was it Einstein's Pauli, wasn't it? I think Wolfgang Pauli.
Oh, I thought Einstein was. I don't know. I know Pauli and Einstein.
Yeah, so I didn't mean to. I'm not sure, but
I don't know what kind of wine Pauli liked. I know him and Jung and Einstein shared a passion for red.
Yeah, well, I think Wolfgang Pauli, because he has really interesting double character. I think he probably liked any wine, I should think. um, but Bollingen has used, I think we could call it a spiritual place or a sacred place. And his encounters with Victor White, and the controversy and the construction of Answer to Job have a lot to do with the tower. And rather sadly, when they kind of fall out, when they meet after that, Jung only invites Victor White to Kushnacht. He doesn't, he's kind of lost his rights, if you like. So, in a sense, the tower is slightly politicized in a logical sense. But yeah, the other interesting thing to think about is the way that it becomes a tower, because it's not a tower. Not a tower. And if you go back through the letters, early on, he talks about as my country seat, my little place in the country. And then a couple of years later, it becomes the tower, my tower with a little t. And then it becomes the tower. So,
but it's an internal space that's being brought up there. It's not as much of a physical change.
Yeah.
I mean, he does build a tower, but when you
so,
see it, you see a house. You don't really, it doesn't register as a tower.
Yeah, true. I mean, there are tower-like elements. I mean, they say the spiritual tower is, is quite slender and elongated, but the first tower is quite stumpy. But it doesn't matter but what I find interesting is that it starts to breed its own symbol, if you like.
Yeah.
And he would declare in MDR that he wanted to sort of constellate or concrete his ideas in form, and there's this kind of logical move to architecture. I think that's kind of true in a way, but I think it's sort of a narrative that's slightly constructed. I mean, I don't mean any disrespect to Jung, but I love the man, but I think it's an ordinary place that becomes extraordinary, rather than beginning as an extraordinary place. But you can't.
That's an interesting perspective. I mean, so I guess there are like two questions. One, what do you have any idea or any speculation what is in the tower? What's up there that no one has seen? And two, Carl Jung's a guy who sees all these patterns in life, religion, self, and starts to inventory them. Do you see patterns in Bollingen of have a sense of what he's doing? Is there quaternity symbolism or some kind of symbolic element that you feel like you've noticed that no one has seen yet?
I'm not sure if I'm the only person to notice it, but I think I'm just going to read something actually, which I've got on the screen, which might help. This is a letter to a guy called Peter de Brandt, written in 1959. And this is a student of architecture who writes to him about sort of archetypal patterns in architecture. And his response broadly is: the circle and the square are connected with the idea of shelter and protection, place of the hearth, concentration of the family and the small animals. And on a higher level, with the symbol of the quatuor circuli, I don't know if I pronounced that correctly, as the dwelling place of the inner man, the abode of gods. So I think, in more direct answer to your question, I think the circle and the square oscillate and then sort of constellate into this triangle. So it's a kind of sort of essay in psychogeometry, but then you get these kind of intermediate spaces that can't be geometrized, if that's a word. So it's kind of geometric and not in equal measure.
But you do see the geometry kind of talking to it. You see his visual thought process there. That's fascinating.
Yeah, and I think the role of Franz Jung, his son, is very underestimated. There's a very lovely book that's just come out, which I'll mention. I can't find it, but anyway, it's called About France, and it's by an American woman, so you should be able to get it in your country. That talks about her visit, or part of it talks about her visit to the tower with Franz Jung, who probably was involved with almost all of it, and so he could unpack some of the kind of narrative and some of the complexity of complicated geometry is sort of crashing into each other. So I think, in answer to your question, I think there's the circle and the square very evident. And we can trace that back to the painting that he looks at in the rectory in Kleinhunigen. It's a painting called the David with the Head of Goliath by Guido Reni, which has David leaning on a circular column with the head of Goliath on a square column, and he's absolutely transfixed by this in the dark sequestered room. And I think in his youth, attics, towers, chapels, squares, circles gather. You know, in a way, I'm probably seeing that into it, but I think they gather around him. Castles, he draws castles.
The architecture in the Red Book has a lot of, you know, circle above a town, above a tower, above, you know, thing.
Yeah, and the fort that is drawn in the Red Book actually is a fort that pretty well existed during Jung's time. It was destroyed in the Treaty of Paris, but its ramparts existed, and it's not exactly like the picture in the Red Book, but he reconstructs it in his mind as this kind of star fort. So I think he's looking, you might say, unconsciously in his formative years, and consciously when he goes to the stupas of India and the council house, building in Fatehpur Sikri in India. He's searching out sacred geometry, but in his youth, it's not so much in the background, but it's more unconscious, I suppose one would say.
Well, can you clarify sacred geometry just a little bit for people who may not be as aware of Western esoteria?
Yeah, well, I mean, quickly put, I think that you know, if we go back to that quote from Jung to the student, the essence, I suppose, is contained. The essence of man and the essence of God as a kind of mystical union is contained in pure geometry. You know, it's a kind of absolute. It's almost Platonic, isn't it? It's a kind of absolute. So, you know, there are different permutations of that, because then you go into sort of polygons and hexagons. I mean, for example, the most baptistries are octagonal. The 8, you know, 7 + 1, you know, the rebirth. And I believe, well, Barbara Hannah says that the spiritual tower, you know, which you can't go into, it has 8 facets inside. I don't think it's octagonal, but I think it has 8 facets. So, you know, that's a deliberate move. The font, when you go into the tower where he pumps water, is 8-sided. So, you know what I mean? There's these kind of...
You see him playing with space and geometry to convey meaning, and math to a certain extent to convey meaning. Yeah,
I do. And then every so often, either he's away, or, you know, the kind of inverse is sort of entrodromic, isn't it? You know, the inverse of the kind of awkward, kind of asymmetric things have to adjust to the next sort of chapter of the geometry. So it's a really complex and non-dualistic array, really, which I find fascinating.
Yeah, and so any idea what's at the top of the tower, what the private rooms in Bollingen are? Do you have any speculation or heard any rumor?
Well, I think I found one picture of the 5th episode, which interestingly is a kind of a concession to habitability, because it's got, I believe, a coal fire, and so they used to hoist up coal, because, you know, Jung was, you know, 80, you know, around that time, or you know, so, you know, it wasn't really viable to move wood or to heat it. And the picture looks as though it's certainly in part lined with timber, and very much looks out over the lake. And I find it quite moving, because he talks about the other Bollingen, i.e. after death, and this kind of aspect to the beyond.
It was a liminal space for him.
yeah. It was a transition between, in effect, life and death. And one biographer, I've forgotten his name, remembers seeing Jung sat in the spiritual tower, which is the next floor down on the second floor, absolutely absorbed in his work, in this other world.
So it's kind of a gateway to top of the tower.
Yeah. And then, he talks about the mountains and the majesty of the lake, that as you say, he wants to live by water, and the majesty of the mountains and the beyond, which ironically is where the stone came from for the tower, the quarries on the other side of the lake, or one of them. So it's evocative, and in a sense, the closure of the first tower and the super closure of the third tower open, and it's a kind of diastole, isn't it, really, if they open and close with these other elements.
And it's hard sometimes to fit all the elements of architecture into a conversation, but you see the space kind of having a conversation, but it's hard to articulate it because it's a visual language. It's not a cognitive, language, a word-based language. But it sounds like you have a real sense of what he's doing there and how he saw it, after spending the time you've spent there.
Yeah. Well, I suppose the other thing we can draw into our conversation is the house dream, 1909, when he's coming back from Freud from America. I think a lot of the tower, I don't think the tower is a replica of the dream, but it has elements of the dream in it. And I think what's interesting about that is that it's kind of palimpsest structure, the one thing laying on top of another. When he discovers the body of the soldier, it gives the cellar. Prior to that, I mean, it's not literally a cellar, but it's got this kind of subterranean space, if you think of the dream. And I think I've written a whole chapter on that, the relationship of the dream as a kind of guide, if you like, to the tower, without it being the building is a dream. It's not a kind of so that's another aspect.
Well, is there anything that we don't get to that you feel like is important about Bollingen? I mean, those are kind of the questions that I had. I don't know a ton about it other than just what comes up in memories, dreams, reflections, and other people's writing about Jung. Anything that you feel like is important we haven't hit on?
Yeah. Well, I think what is important is to, this isn't the best answer, but I'll start with it, is to trace it deeper into his psychic and physical history. I think Bollinger's configured as this kind of last chapter, if you like, of his work. I think it's much more almost circumambulatory, that it's this
it grows as he grows.
Yeah, and I think I have a sense, I've not been entirely been able to constellate this, is that he, in a sense, the building is designing itself. It has a kind of architectural unconscious, if you like.
He was listening to the place and then helping it be birthed. It wasn't his blueprint that he was just building.
Yeah. And he talks about that because when he writes to Christina Morgan, who also built a tower in America, he says, well, actually, when you start your building, you'll know that it releases all sorts of spirits. He doesn't call them spirits, but ghoulies or something like that, So there is this kind of literally genius loci.
Specters, maybe, is that the word?
Pardon?
Spectre, was that the word?
No, anyway, we get the and so I think he's listening, which is an architectural act, but I think it's much richer than that. I think the building is leading his ideas, responding to his ideas. If you look at his diagrams as you trace them through the collected works, they become much more three-dimensional. So I think there's this kind of traffic.
He's paying religious attention to the space in the building. Absolutely,
yeah. And then a second point is the kind of legacy of the tower. So Marie van France built a tower. Well, it was designed by Franz Jung, Jung's son. And I'm very grateful to Gotti, who lives there, who shared with me the drawings, which are beautiful drawings of this tower. So her tower becomes the kind of perfect tower, inverted commas, because it's this quadrate. You know, it doesn't have to evolve. It's just this fixed thing. And Christina Morgan's tower is this very slender circular thing. So the circle and the square come back, in this kind of legacy. I mean, I just think they're all fascinating. And I suppose, I think Marie von Franz got a bit fed up with Jung saying, well, your tower needs to be like this is my tower, just get out of it, sort of thing. But I think that the main point to answer your lead is that it's the reciprocity. So reciprocity between place, psyche, ideas. It's a kind of psychic place, and I suppose it's not a singular ambition. It's about the voice of the natural world, the lake lapping in, those who visit. Tony Wolff's role must have been enormous in the tower. Franz Jungs, the builders, so this idea of this kind of solitary figure with this solitary kind of symbol of is reductive, I think. But
well, yeah, that's a living symbol for sure. So any speculation on things that are there that haven't been seen, or any rumor, or do you like the mystery of that? It's not ever fully open or known.
I like the mystery. Initially, I was going to ask maybe what the Jung family, and maybe one day I'll be brave enough to do this, to say, could I measure the whole of this building, do a drawing of the whole of the building?
So there'd be like a blueprint of it.
I don't think there are blueprints, because I think I've tried to track. Some of them would have had some experts would have had building permits, but there was a fire in the St. Gallen archive, and I don't know if they were in there, but I think I have the sense that they don't exist, or don't exist now. But then more recently, maybe this is post-justified, I just think, in fact, Jung's great-grandson, Daniel, said to me, well, it means different things to different people. I think it has to just be universal, and it's, well, not universal in a way, it's very sort of personal as well as being universal. So I'm kind of fine with the mystery. But
well, that's nice.
Well, it's kind of every time I go, I see something else, and obviously, you're one slightly in conversation with people, and you're trying to be polite and respectful, and you can't take photographs. But out to the side, if you are, you notice something, and it's always giving. It's always coming alive.
And it's still used. It's not a museum. I mean, it's still used as he intended, left almost as is by the family for a holiday house. Sometimes they're on holiday there, and sometimes it's empty.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that it would be a great shame I think Jung would not be pleased if it became a museum. Obviously that's happened to Freud's Vienna home, and actually the London home as well, which is fine. So it's not to decry people who've gone down that route, but I think I mean, the way it was explained to me is that it would be difficult to show people around because the stairs are so narrow. But I think that's really a kind of, sort of batting away the problem. This is a home for the Jung
family,
the Jung forever, and so should it be,
Yeah.
But that said, as you've observed, that they're very accommodating in, if you knock at the door. Which I think is incredible. Most of us wouldn't do that, wouldn't they? Would we? We'd say,
especially with the amount of people who come.
Yeah. I mean, I think they try and organise things when people come at the same time, but of course, for me, I always wanted just a personal conversation. Just to, please, tell me something that is will feed my passion, if you like.
Well, is there anything that we can point people to who want to find more about your work, or pre-order your book, or go to a website? I mean, where can we direct them? People that are interested in what you've said here.
Well, I'd be happy for you to share my email. Um, should I read that out, or
You can, or I can also put it in the podcast notes, the show
yeah,
notes, if you want
yeah,
that.
because at the moment I'm hoping that my PhD will be, or at least written, by perhaps January, February, and then I'm really hoping it becomes a book. So, in answer to the question about a book, that's waiting. I do sometimes lectures I've done have been recorded, and I'd happily do a lecture for someone if because obviously a lot of this is quite visual, and so if we needed to illustrate things more, I could do that. But a person that would be, I know that you approached Lucy first. Lucy Huskinson, my supervisor, writes a lot on it. So I think
Well, Nietzsche
there's.
is kind of her thing.
Pardon?
Nietzsche,
Yeah,
she does a lot of Nietzschean architecture also, right?
Yeah. In fact, she's in the process of finishing a book on that. So her book, The Architecture of the Mimetic Self, I think is an important, very, very important book. And obviously I'm biased, but I do feel that. And then Claire Marcus Cooper wrote a really beautiful paper called House, a Symbol of Self, which is available comparatively easy as a PDF. So those, and then more recently, Thomas Barry has written about architecture in this sense. But in terms of the tower itself, I'm hoping that's my job, because it would put a hole in the side of the ship if someone else was writing. But of course, it would always come from a different perspective and be different. So I think we have to probably wait. I don't know, 6 months or something. But
so hopefully, 2023, the book will be for sale. So definitely Google, and I'll share your email address too if people want a personalized talk or presentation for an organization.
Sorry, Joel, to interrupt. What would be lovely about the 2023 is it would be 100 years after the tower. So that's my kind of aim. But it's a glorious obsession that I've been dramatic. I've sort of given up everything to do. So I think the story, or a story, needs to be told about it, which is really why we're talking, isn't it? But
well, Martin, your passion is beautiful. I really appreciate you sharing that with everybody, and I will definitely get linked to your email address, and then I hope to read your book one day. So good luck.
And thank you, Joel, for the opportunity. I mean, obviously, what helps is to be able to succinctly summarize what one's doing. So I want to thank you for the opportunity.
Sure.
And who knows? I think we need. It's an ecological argument, really, isn't it? If you really zoomed up, how do we belong to ourselves and to place? That's really what we're talking about. So, but thank you.
Yeah, of course. And thank you. Thank you so much for your time.